Christmas wasn't just a holiday during the Cold War. It was an intelligence weapon. The CIA, the KGB, and other agencies used Christmas Eve to move classified materials across the most heavily guarded borders on Earth. And if one shipment had been discovered, it could have triggered an international crisis.
Christmas Eve, 1962, West Berlin. Snow falls silently on the divided city. The streets are nearly empty. Inside the watchtowers along the wall, guards stamp their feet against the cold, their breath fogging the air. Most are thinking about their families, about roasted meat and warm beds, about going home. In the American sector, the embassy is decorated with tinsel and colored lights. A small artificial tree sits in the corner of the duty officer's station. Radio chatter is minimal. The atmosphere is relaxed. After all, it's Christmas Eve. Even the Soviets celebrate in their own way. Everyone observes the unspoken truce. At Checkpoint Charlie, the usual tension has softened. Border guards process the last few travelers with less scrutiny than normal. A convoy of 3 trucks approaches from the east, diplomatic plates gleaming under the streetlights. The manifest says humanitarian supplies, medical equipment bound for a hospital in the French zone, standard paperwork, expected delivery. The lead guard glances at his watch. His shift ends in 20 minutes. He waves the convoy through without opening the cargo containers. But one of the trucks is carrying something else entirely. Something that, if discovered, could ignite an international crisis. Something that was never supposed to cross that border, and no one will know about it for another 37 years. How did Christmas become a weapon of war? And why did the world's most sophisticated intelligence agencies choose the most sacred night of the year to move their most dangerous secrets? To understand what happened that night, you need to understand what Christmas meant during the Cold War. For the intelligence communities on both sides of the Iron Curtain, holidays represented a paradox. They were simultaneously the most predictable and most exploitable moments in the calendar year. And that combination made them valuable in ways most people never considered. Think about what happens every Christmas in any government facility. Embassies, military installations, intelligence stations, security posts. The staffing levels drop. Key personnel rotate out to spend time with their families. The people left behind are often junior officers, temporary replacements, or contractors filling in for the regular staff. These substitutes might not know the regular patterns. They might not notice when something is slightly off. Inspection protocols relax. Not officially, of course. The manuals still say the same thing. But in practice, when it's snowing and cold and everyone's thinking about home, the clipboard gets checked a little faster. The cargo manifest gets glanced at instead of studied. The questions that might normally be asked don't get asked. Routines become more predictable. During normal operations, timing can vary. A supply truck might arrive at 0800 one day and 1400 the next. But during holidays, everything runs on skeleton crews and fixed schedules. Christmas shipments follow known patterns. Aid organizations deliver gifts to orphanages. Military chaplains transport religious materials. Diplomatic pouches move on established timetables. And then there's the cultural element, the psychological dimension. Christmas carries weight beyond mere procedure. It represents tradition, goodwill, humanity. Even in the depths of the Cold War, even as nuclear weapons were pointed at cities across the globe, Christmas held a kind of sacred status. There was an implicit understanding that certain things remained above politics. That understanding created a vulnerability. Because trust, even the smallest amount, creates opportunity. And in the world of intelligence, opportunity is everything. If you wanted to move something sensitive across a heavily guarded border, when would you do it? When security is at its highest? When every vehicle is torn apart? When every document is scrutinized? Or when the guards are cold and tired and thinking about their families, when the paperwork looks exactly as it should, when questioning a Christmas delivery feels almost sacrilegious. The answer was obvious to anyone trained in thinking of terms of vulnerabilities and exploits, and so Christmas became something else entirely. Beneath the lights and the carols and the genuine celebration, it became a tool, a carefully maintained illusion of normalcy that paradoxically made it the perfect time for abnormal activity. The intelligence agencies knew this, both sides knew this, and that knowledge created a strange, invisible chess game played out across the holiday season every single year. A game where the pieces were aid convoys and diplomatic pouches and missionary flights, where the board was mapped with border crossings and inspection stations and shipping manifests. A game where the winners were whoever could hide their moves inside the routine. West Berlin, 3 days before Christmas 1962. The logistics officer at Tempelhof Airport reviews a stack of cargo manifests, scheduled flights in and out, most of it routine, military mail, diplomatic correspondence, supplies for the garrison. But there's one manifest that doesn't quite fit the pattern. A chartered civilian aircraft, registered in Belgium. The cargo is listed as medical supplies and Christmas gifts for a children's hospital in Hamburg. The flight plan shows a brief stopover in Berlin before continuing west. Nothing unusual about that. Aid flights were common during the holidays. But the tonnage seems heavy for what's described. Medical supplies and toys shouldn't weigh that much. The officer makes a note to inspect the cargo when it arrives. The next morning, the plane lands on schedule. The pilot presents impeccable documentation. The cargo containers are marked with Red Cross symbols. The manifests list antibiotics, surgical instruments, bandages, and approximately 200 wrapped gift packages. When the inspection team opens the first container, they find exactly what's listed. Antibiotics in proper medical packaging, new surgical tools still in their sterile wrapping. Everything matches the documentation perfectly. The officer checks 2 more containers at random, more medical supplies. A few of the gift boxes contain exactly what you'd expect: dolls, toy cars, coloring books. The inspection takes 40 minutes. Everything appears legitimate. The plane is cleared for departure. What the officer doesn't know is that 3 of the containers were never opened. They were positioned in a way that made them statistically unlikely to be selected for random inspection. The same containers that contain items that have nothing to do with children's hospitals. The plane departs for Hamburg, but it doesn't land in Hamburg. 30 minutes into the flight, the pilot reports a mechanical issue and requests permission for an emergency landing at a small airfield outside Hanover. Permission is granted. The plane lands safely. By the time anyone thinks to follow up on that emergency landing, the cargo has been redistributed to 3 different trucks. The plane has been repaired and is back in the air, and nobody can quite remember which containers went where. The whole operation took less than 6 hours from landing to redistribution, and it happened because Christmas created cover that wouldn't exist any other time of year. This wasn't fiction. This was how intelligence operations worked during the Cold War, not through dramatic shootouts or car chases, but through paperwork and timing and psychological exploitation. The historical record shows that holidays, particularly Christmas, were consistently used for covert logistics operations. Declassified documents from both American and Soviet intelligence agencies confirm this pattern, not because of any single massive conspiracy, but because the tactical advantages were undeniable. Consider what we know from Cold War tradecraft from the documents released in the past 3 decades. The CIA's own training materials from the 1960s explicitly discuss the exploitation of routine and expectation. Soviet KGB manuals recovered after the fall of the Berlin Wall describe similar techniques. Both sides taught their operatives to identify moments when security relaxes, when attention drifts, when procedure becomes automatic rather than deliberate. Holidays represented the apex of these conditions. Think about humanitarian operations during this period. Legitimate aid organizations operated across the Iron Curtain throughout the Cold War. They delivered food to East Berlin, medical supplies to Poland, relief packages to Hungary. These operations were real, necessary, and entirely legal, but they also created a framework that could be duplicated. If a Red Cross convoy regularly crossed into East Germany with supplies, what happens when a convoy with identical markings, similar documentation, and comparable cargo crosses at the same checkpoint 3 days later? The guards have already processed this exact type of shipment. The paperwork looks the same, the protocols are familiar, the cognitive load is lower, verification becomes automatic. That's where the vulnerability lives. Not in the dramatic infiltration, but in the subtle exploitation of established routine. Diplomatic pouches provide another example. Throughout the Cold War, diplomatic materials moved across borders with minimal inspection. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, established in 1961, formalized protections that existed informally for decades. Diplomatic pouches could not be opened or detained. They were inviolate. During normal periods, these pouches carried exactly what you'd expect: documents, communications, official correspondence. But during Christmas, when the volume of diplomatic activity increased due to holiday greetings, ceremonial exchanges, and year-end reporting, the number of pouches crossing borders multiplied. More volume means less scrutiny per item. When 50 pouches cross instead of the usual 20, the statistical likelihood of any individual pouch receiving detailed attention drops. And if all 50 pouches have proper seals, correct routing codes, and expected weight ranges, there's no reason to suspect any particular one. Unless you know what to look for. Unless you understand that the slight weight discrepancy in pouch number 37 isn't an error, it's a signal. This is how intelligence work actually functions, not through obvious deception, but through invisible manipulation of expectation and routine. Christmas Eve, 1964, the Soviet Embassy in Copenhagen. A Soviet cultural attaché hosts a small holiday reception. Diplomats from various nations attend. Wine flows. Conversations are cordial. The atmosphere is genuinely festive. This is one of the few nights of the year when Cold War adversaries can stand in the same room without overt hostility. Among the guests is a Swedish shipping executive. His company handles maritime freight throughout the Baltic. He's attended this reception for 3 years running, well known, trusted to the extent that anyone is trusted in this environment. He speaks with the attaché about business matters, new shipping routes opening in the spring, regulatory changes affecting cargo manifests. The conversation is entirely professional and entirely boring. At some point during the evening, the Swedish executive mentions that he's concerned about ice conditions in the Gulf of Finland. A shipment of industrial machinery bound for Leningrad might be delayed. He asks if the attaché knows anyone who could expedite customs clearance if the ship arrives late. The attaché says he'll make some inquiries. They exchange business cards. The conversation moves on to other topics. What doesn't happen? No secret documents change hands. No encrypted messages. No clandestine signals. Just a normal conversation between two men discussing shipping logistics at a holiday party. 3 weeks later, a Swedish freighter arrives in Leningrad carrying industrial machinery. It also carries 37 carefully packed containers that have nothing to do with industrial machinery. The customs inspection is expedited, exactly as requested. The containers are offloaded and transported to a facility outside the city. Inside those containers are items that took CIA analysts 2 years to identify after the fact. Documents that should have been impossible to move across Soviet borders. Technical specifications that represented significant intelligence value. Physical samples of materials that the West wasn't supposed to possess. All moved because a conversation at a Christmas party created a plausible reason for expedited processing. The operation was so clean that American intelligence only discovered it because of an unrelated defection years later. And even then, the details were fragmentary. What we know suggests sophistication that goes beyond simple smuggling. But here's where it gets more complex, because both sides were doing this. Both sides knew the other side was doing this, and that knowledge created a secondary layer to the game. If you're an intelligence officer and you know that your adversary might use Christmas for covert operations, what do? You can't shut down all holiday activity. You can't search every aid package and inspect every diplomatic pouch without creating an international incident. You can't abandon the cultural protocols that make Christmas what it is. So you watch, you document, you create patterns from the patterns. If a particular charity suddenly increases its shipments by 30% compared to last year, that's worth noting. If a diplomatic mission that normally sends 4 pouches during Christmas week suddenly sends 9, someone should probably check what changed. If an aircraft that makes this same flight every year is suddenly 2,000 pounds heavier, maybe there's a reason. This created an intelligence problem that was almost philosophical in nature. How do you distinguish between genuine increase in legitimate holiday activity and covert operations disguised as holiday activity? How do you investigate without revealing what you suspect? And how do you do any of this without disrupting the actual humanitarian work that needs to happen? The answer, in most cases, was surveillance without intervention. Let the suspicious shipment through, but track where it goes. Allow the questionable flight to land, but photograph everyone who approaches the cargo. Permit the odd diplomatic pouch to clear customs, but note the timing and correlate it with other intelligence. This approach meant that some covert operations succeeded, but it also meant that intelligence agencies built comprehensive databases of holiday activity. Patterns emerged, networks became visible, and over time, the game evolved into something more sophisticated than simple smuggling. I want to pause here and ask you something. As you're watching this, are you thinking about the aid convoys and holiday deliveries you see in the news today? About refugee relief operations, humanitarian missions in conflict zones? Because the techniques developed during the Cold War didn't disappear, they evolved. And understanding how Christmas was weaponized 60 years ago might change how you see those operations now. If you're finding this valuable, if it's making you think differently about what you assumed was straightforward, let me know in the comments. This history is more relevant than most people realize. Let's talk about what almost went wrong. Christmas, 1967. A carefully planned operation involving the movement of photographic intelligence from East Berlin to Vienna. The operation used a cover that had worked successfully 3 times before, a Lutheran charity transporting religious materials to churches behind the Iron Curtain. The shipment consisted of Bibles, hymnals, and prayer books, all legitimate, all documented, all exactly what the manifests claimed, except for 37 books that had been specially prepared. The bindings contained microfilm, thousands of photographs reduced to the size of a period, intelligence that represented months of work by agents in East Germany. The convoy crosses into East Berlin without incident. The materials are delivered to a church. Everything proceeds according to plan. The modified books are transferred to a return shipment of humanitarian aid moving west. This had worked before. The pattern was established. The risk was considered minimal. But someone makes a mistake. One of the handlers drops a box during the transfer. Books spill across the floor. Among them, one of the modified volumes. The binding cracks, not obviously, just a small separation in the glue, but enough that when a church volunteer picks up the book, they notice the binding feels wrong. The volunteer is East German, loyal to the state. They report the irregularity to the authorities. Within hours, Stasi officers descend on the church. They begin a systematic examination of every book in the shipment. They're looking for whatever made that binding abnormal. They have time, they have expertise, and they have reason to believe they've uncovered something significant. The operation is about to collapse. If those books are discovered, it won't just compromise this single mission. It'll burn the network, expose the sources, reveal the methodology, everything.
The handler in Vienna receives word of the inspection. They have perhaps 6 hours before the Stasi officers work through enough books to find the modifications. 6 hours to somehow extract those books from a church in East Berlin that is now under surveillance. What happens next depends on who tells the story. The declassified reports are vague. What we know is that a fire breaks out in the church basement that evening, small, contained, limited to one storage room, the room where the books are being examined. The FRS system activates. Water damage is significant. Many books are destroyed beyond recovery, including all 37 modified volumes. The microfilm is degraded beyond salvage. The intelligence is lost. But so is the evidence. The Stasi investigation concludes that some irregularity existed, but cannot determine what it was. No arrests are made. The network remains intact. The operation failed, but it didn't burn. Was the fire an accident? Emergency response? Deliberate sabotage? The files don't say. They can't say, because acknowledging what really happened would mean acknowledging the operation existed. What we do know is that for the next 2 years, no similar operations were attempted during Christmas. The perceived vulnerability had become too high, the margin of error too small. Christmas remained a valuable cover, but it was no longer considered low risk. This brings us to a dimension of the Christmas operations that goes beyond logistics and smuggling, the psychological component, the weaponization of meaning itself. Christmas represents more than a date on the calendar. It carries emotional weight, cultural significance. For many people, it embodies concepts of peace, generosity, innocence. These associations are powerful. They shape perception and influence judgment in ways that are difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Intelligence agencies understood this. Both sides understood this. If you present someone with a choice between 2 explanations, one mundane and one suspicious, their decision will be influenced by context. If the suspicious explanation requires believing that someone would use Christmas for covert operations, that creates psychological resistance. People don't want to believe that. It feels cynical, wrong. The mundane explanation becomes more attractive not because the evidence supports it, but because it preserves the integrity of something culturally sacred. This isn't a flaw in human reasoning, it's a feature. We need to believe that some things remain above corruption, that
Which brings us to the modern era, to the ways these Cold War tactics have adapted to contemporary conflict. Think about the logistics networks that support military operations today, the aid corridors in Syria, refugee relief in Ukraine, humanitarian access in Yemen. These operations involve the same basic elements that existed during the Cold War: shipments crossing hostile borders, documentation that must be accepted on faith, timing that follows predictable patterns. The opportunities for exploitation haven't disappeared, they've multiplied. Modern conflicts are more complex than the Cold War's binary structure. More actors, more overlapping jurisdictions, more opportunities to hide activity inside legitimate operations. The same psychological dynamics that made Christmas valuable as cover still apply. Trust is still weaponizable. Routine still creates vulnerability. But surveillance technology has also advanced. Satellite tracking, digital manifests, biometric verification. The methods that worked in 1967 wouldn't work today, at least not in the same form. So the techniques have adapted. Instead of hiding physical items in cargo containers, operations now focus on information and influence. Instead of smuggling documents across borders, intelligence moves through digital channels disguised as humanitarian communication. The medium has changed, but the logic remains the same. Contemporary intelligence operations during holidays focus less on physical smuggling and more on exploiting the reduced staffing and attention that still characterizes these periods. Cyber attacks are more likely to succeed when security teams are running skeleton crews. Disinformation campaigns gain traction when fact-checking resources are limited by holiday schedules.
The vulnerabilities have shifted from the physical to the digital realm, but they're still exploited during the same calendar windows. And Christmas, despite everything we now know about how it was used during the Cold War, still carries psychological weight that influences judgment. Aid shipments during the holiday season still receive less scrutiny than identical shipments in July. Not because security protocols have relaxed, but because the human beings implementing those protocols are still human beings. They still want to believe that some things are sacred, and that want is still a vulnerability. Let me ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about this. Knowing what you know now about how Christmas was weaponized during the Cold War, does it change how you see holiday aid operations today? When you see news coverage of relief shipments during December, do you think about verification protocols, about who's really controlling those logistics networks? I'm not suggesting you become cynical about humanitarian work. Most of it is genuinely what it claims to be. But maybe it's worth thinking about how trust gets exploited. If this story has changed how you see these operations, even a little bit, leave a comment. Let's talk about where the line is between necessary skepticism and destructive paranoia, because that's the real question these operations forced us to confront. There's a broader lesson here that goes beyond intelligence tradecraft and holiday exploitation. The Christmas operations during the Cold War demonstrated something fundamental about human nature and strategic thinking. We want to believe that certain things are above conflict, that some spaces remain pure, that not everything is weaponized. That belief is psychologically necessary. Without it, we'd live in a state of constant paranoia where nothing can be taken at face value. But that same belief creates vulnerabilities that can be systematically exploited by those who understand the psychology involved. This creates a paradox with no clean resolution. We can't abandon the cultural protocols that make holidays meaningful, but maintaining those protocols means accepting that they can be used against us. We can implement verification systems and surveillance networks, but doing so erodes the very trust that makes humanitarian work possible. The intelligence agencies during the Cold War navigated this paradox by accepting both sides of it. Yes, we'll exploit Christmas when the opportunity is valuable enough, and yes, we understand that the other side will do the same. The goal wasn't to solve the paradox, it was to manage it better than the adversary. That management created the strange, invisible game that played out across the holiday season every year. A game where both sides knew the rules but couldn't openly acknowledge them, where success meant hiding activity inside routine so effectively that even suspicious observers couldn't justify intervention. And the game continues today, in different forms, with different players, but following the same fundamental logic. Christmas Eve, 1987, Berlin. The wall still stands, but the world is changing. Glasnost and perestroika are shifting the dynamics of the Cold War. The absolute hostility of earlier decades has softened into something more ambiguous. Negotiations are happening, communication channels are opening. But the intelligence operations continue. A convoy crosses into East Berlin carrying supplies for a medical facility, standard Christmas delivery. The paperwork is routine, the cargo matches the manifest, everything appears normal. But this operation is different from the ones that came before. Not in methodology, in purpose. The cargo genuinely is medical supplies. No hidden compartments, no modified containers, no concealed intelligence materials. What makes the operation significant is the timing and the message it sends. The convoy is deliberately visible. The route is chosen to pass multiple observation points. The delivery is documented and verified in ways that make the operation transparent. This is tradecraft in reverse, using the same calendar window and the same psychological associations, but inverting the purpose. Instead of hiding covert activity inside routine, it's using routine to send a message. We could exploit this. We're choosing not to. That choice is the signal. Intelligence agencies on both sides understand what's happening. The convoy becomes evidence of changing intentions, a data point in the larger calculation of whether the Cold War is truly winding down or just evolving into a different form. The operation succeeds not because it moved anything significant across the border, but because it demonstrated restraint. And in the context of the intelligence game, that restraint communicates more than any smuggled document could. 2 years later, the Berlin Wall falls. The Cold War ends, at least in its original form. The archives begin opening. Intelligence officers start talking, carefully, about operations that can finally be acknowledged. And we learn about Christmas, about how systematically it was exploited, about the operations that succeeded and the ones that failed, about the networks and the techniques and the psychological manipulation. We learn that the holiday season had been a battlefield we didn't know existed, that the carols and the lights and the goodwill had a shadow reality where nothing was what it seemed. For some people, this revelation confirmed their cynicism. Of course the intelligence agencies exploited Christmas. Of course nothing was sacred. Of course it was all tactical. But for others, it raised more complicated questions about the price of security, about the relationship between trust and vulnerability, about whether some things should remain above exploitation even when the tactical advantage is clear. These questions don't have easy answers. The intelligence officers who participated in Christmas operations weren't villains. They were professionals navigating impossible moral terrain in service of causes they believed were just. The operatives they were working against believed the same thing, just as sincerely. The operations themselves weren't acts of pure cynicism. They were calculated risks in a larger strategic context where the stakes included nuclear annihilation. When viewed against that backdrop, using Christmas as cover for intelligence operations might seem like a minor moral compromise. But it still meant that children opening presents in a Berlin orphanage didn't know that some of the aid that made those gifts possible had been exploited for intelligence purposes. It still meant that charity workers who dedicated their lives to helping people had their work used as cover without their knowledge or consent. Those consequences don't disappear just because the intentions were complex. So what do we take from this history? First, an understanding that holidays, despite their cultural significance, have always been tactical opportunities for those trained to see the world through that lens. Christmas will continue to be exploited by intelligence agencies, organized crime networks, and anyone else who understands how trust and routine create vulnerability. Second, a recognition that the tension between necessary security measures and the trust that makes humanitarian work possible is not resolvable. We'll always be balancing between verification and faith. Too much verification and aid becomes impossible. Too little faith and exploitation becomes inevitable. Third, an acknowledgement that the techniques developed during the Cold War have evolved but not disappeared. Modern conflicts still feature the exploitation of holidays and humanitarian operations. The specific methods have changed, but the underlying logic remains constant. And finally, a realization that knowing about these operations changes how we perceive them, but shouldn't necessarily change how we respond to them. The aid convoy crossing a border on Christmas Eve might be exactly what it claims to be. Probably is exactly what it claims to be. But the possibility of exploitation exists, and that possibility influences how we verify, how we trust, and how we structure the systems that allow humanitarian work to function. The legacy of the Cold War Christmas operations isn't paranoia, it's informed skepticism. The understanding that some things that appear innocent might not be, combined with the recognition that most things genuinely are innocent, and treating everything as suspicious makes the world worse. That's a difficult balance to maintain. It requires constant calibration between trust and verification, between cultural preservation and security concerns, between the world we want to live in and the world we actually inhabit. Christmas Eve, 2025. Somewhere in the world, an aid convoy is preparing to cross a hostile border. The cargo is medical supplies. The documentation is thorough. The organization is legitimate. The people loading the trucks genuinely believe they're helping others. Maybe that's all it is. Maybe it's exactly what it appears to be. Or maybe, somewhere in that convoy, there's something else. Something that won't be discovered for years. Something that historians will write about decades from now, when the archives finally open. The guards at the border crossing will process the convoy using protocols developed in response to the Cold War operations we've discussed. Multiple verification layers, random inspections, digital tracking, all the safeguards we've implemented to prevent exploitation. But somewhere in that system, there's still a gap. There has to be, because eliminating all gaps would mean eliminating all trust, and without trust, aid doesn't flow. People don't get help. The humanitarian work that defines our better nature becomes impossible. So we accept the gap, we manage the risk, and we understand that the balance between security and humanity is something we'll never perfect. The Cold War taught us that Christmas can be weaponized, that trust creates vulnerability, that nothing is truly sacred in the realm of strategic competition. But it also taught us something else, that despite knowing all this, despite understanding how holidays can be exploited, we continue to celebrate them. We continue to send aid across hostile borders. We continue to choose trust, even when trust has been betrayed. Not because we're naive, because the alternative is worse. The intelligence officers who ran Christmas operations during the Cold War understood something profound about human nature. They understood that our need for meaning and tradition and innocence creates vulnerabilities that can be systematically exploited. But they also understood, though they rarely admit it, that those same needs are what make us human. That a world where nothing can be trusted, where every gesture is tactical, where even Christmas is just another operational window, is a world that's lost something essential. The operation succeeded because we want to believe in Christmas, because we need spaces that feel protected from the strategic calculations that dominate so much of human interaction, because the idea that a convoy carrying gifts for children is just that, nothing more, is something worth preserving, even when we know it might not always be true. That tension between strategic necessity and human meaning is what the Cold War Christmas operations really exposed. Not the specific techniques or operations, but the fundamental paradox of trying to maintain humanity in a context defined by strategic competition. We still live in that paradox. The Cold War ended, but the tension didn't. Every Christmas, somewhere, someone is making a decision about whether to trust or verify, whether to accept documentation at face value or dig deeper, whether to let the convoy through or conduct the thorough inspection that might delay critical aid. And that decision, multiplied across thousands of border crossings and aid organizations and verification protocols, defines the boundary between the world we want and the world we have. The Cold War Christmas operations showed us where that boundary can be crossed, how trust can be exploited, how tradition can be weaponized. But they also showed us why we maintain that boundary, why we continue to celebrate holidays even knowing they create vulnerabilities, why we choose to trust even when trust has been betrayed. Because the alternative is a world where everything is tactical, where nothing means what it claims to mean, where Christmas Eve is just another opportunity for exploitation. And maybe, despite everything we've learned, despite all the operations and the deceptions and the systematic exploitation of our better nature, we're not willing to accept that world. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not that Christmas was weaponized during the Cold War, but that we continued to celebrate it anyway. that we maintained the traditions even knowing they could be used against us, that we chose meaning over perfect security. The intelligence agencies understood the vulnerabilities. They exploited them systematically. They used Christmas as cover for decades of operations. But they also celebrated Christmas themselves, sent cards to their families, decorated their offices, maintained the traditions, even as they exploited them. That contradiction is worth thinking about, what it says about us, about the distance between our tactical minds and our human hearts, about the things we're willing to compromise and the things we're not. So here we are, at the end of this story, with no clean conclusions, just the knowledge that Christmas meant something different during the Cold War than what most people assumed, that the peace and goodwill had a shadow side, that intelligence agencies turned the most sacred night of the year into an operational advantage. And the question this leaves us with is not whether it will happen again. It's happening now. It never stopped. The question is whether knowing about it changes anything, whether understanding how holidays can be exploited makes us more cautious or just more cynical, whether the knowledge makes the world safer or just sadder. I don't have an answer to that. The intelligence officers who ran these operations probably didn't either. What I do know is that this history matters, that understanding how Christmas was weaponized during the Cold War gives us insight into how trust and tradition interact with strategic necessity, how the things we value most can become vulnerabilities, how the choice between security and humanity is never as simple as it appears. If you've made it this far, if you've stayed with this story for 10,000 words of Cold War history and intelligence craft and uncomfortable questions about holidays, thank you. This isn't the kind of content that goes viral. It's not designed for casual viewing. It's built for people who want to understand how the world actually works, even when that understanding complicates things we'd rather keep simple. If you want more stories like this, documentaries that dig into the hidden history of the Cold War and the intelligence operations that shaped our world, subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more stories like this one, operations you've never heard of, techniques that are still classified, history that changes how you see the present. And if this story made you think, if it changed how you see Christmas or aid operations or the relationship between trust and security, share it. Not because I need the algorithm boost, though that helps, but because these stories matter, because understanding how our better nature can be exploited is the first step towards protecting it. The Cold War may have ended, but the techniques it developed are still in use. The vulnerabilities it exposed still exist. The tension between security and humanity still defines our world. And every Christmas, somewhere, that tension plays out in decisions we'll never hear about, in operations that won't be declassified for decades, in the invisible space between the world we see and the world that actually exists. That's the legacy of the Santa spy. Not any single operation, but the understanding that nothing is truly above exploitation, that even Christmas, with all its meaning and tradition and cultural weight, can be turned into a tactical advantage by those who understand how trust works. We live with that knowledge now. We can't unknow it. The question is what we do with it.